The year was 793. On the northeast coast of Northumbria, beneath a sky bruised with thunder, a monastery stood like a lone rib of holiness against the savage North Sea. Lindisfarne. The monks there whispered their prayers to a god who never answered quickly, but always heard. The air reeked of salt, seaweed, and sanctity, a fragile world of parchment and prayer, candles flickering over illuminated texts, and the soft murmuring of men who believed their isolation kept them safe from sin and steel alike. But that dawn, as the tide heaved under a bleeding sunrise, the horizon birthed shapes that should never have come ashore. Long, black ships, slender, dragon-headed, moving with the arrogance of predators who had smelled fear. They came like ghosts from the storm. No warning, no parley. Only the sound of oars, 100 beating hearts in rhythm, driving wood through water, and the low cry of seabirds fleeing inland. The monks did not know the word for Viking yet, but they would learn it before the day ended, and it would never leave their tongues again. A young novice, Brother Cuthard, was the first to see them. He stood on the rocky outcrop, clutching a wooden cross, his breath frosting in the wind. He thought they were traders at first, ships from the north bringing wares. But when he saw the shields hung along the hulls, bright with painted beasts, and men with plaited hair and naked blades standing shoulder to shoulder, he dropped his cross and ran. Inside the abbey, Abbot Humbert was reading from the Psalms when Cuthard burst in. His words were fragments, trembling, carried on terror. Ships. From the sea. Men with axes. The older monks exchanged uneasy glances, but they did not understand the scale of what was coming. They had no soldiers, no walls worth defending, no weapons beyond faith and ritual. And so they prayed. When the Vikings landed, the earth itself seemed to groan beneath their boots. They were giants to the English monks, wild-haired, their faces carved by cold seas and old scars. They spoke in thunder, laughed like wolves. They called to each other in a tongue that sounded like breaking ice, and they burned everything they touched. Lindisfarne, the Holy Isle, became a slaughterhouse before the bells could finish tolling for matins. Men who had never lifted a sword were dragged by their tonsured heads, begging, as axes came down. The air was choked with smoke and screams. The sound of Latin prayers drowned in the Viking war cries. Odin, Thor, blood for the gods. They slit throats over the altars, splintered the reliquaries, and tore open the chests where gold and scripture lay side by side. They laughed at the painted saints, mocked their dead god, and melted chalices into rough coins. To them, the monastery was not holy. It was a treasure house guarded by fools. But what they found in the side cloisters intrigued them more than the gold. A small group of nuns, trembling, clutching their crosses, their white wimples stained with soot. The raiders had not expected women, and this discovery ignited something darker than greed. The Vikings had gods of war, but they also had gods of lust. In their myths, women were spoils, to be taken, owned, broken. When their ships returned home, their sagas would not just tell of silver and slaughter, but of wives taken from foreign lands. And the Christian nuns of Lindisfarne, with their chastity and vows, were an affront that demanded desecration. They dragged the women into the open courtyard. The sea wind whipped their veils like banners of surrender. Some prayed aloud, invoking Christ's mercy. Others were silent, their eyes fixed on the crucifix above the doorway, as if waiting for it to come alive. The Vikings jeered, called them brides of a dead man, and began what the monks later called the unmaking. It was not enough to kill them. They wanted to shame them first, to rip apart not just their bodies, but the sanctity they represented. The chronicles written later, in secret, in trembling Latin, would describe it with restraint, but the horror bleeds through the ink. The women were stripped, beaten, mocked, and worse, all before the eyes of those they had prayed beside. Some of the raiders forced the monks to watch, to kneel and bless their tormentors, before striking them down too. The smell of burning vellum and human flesh mingled in the air, and the sea itself seemed to recoil from the island. By dusk, Lindisfarne was ash. The holy books lay scattered, their pages curling in the wind like dead leaves. The bodies of the nuns were cast into the sea, not buried, not blessed, but left for the tides to claim. For the first time in living memory, England had tasted true terror. Word spread across the kingdoms. Heathen men from the north had desecrated a holy place, slaughtered priests, and defiled women vowed to God. It was not just an attack, it was a message. They mocked our God and took his brides. The sea carried their laughter. The shock rippled across Christendom. In Francia, Alcuin of York wrote to King Athelred, his words heavy with despair. The pagans desecrated the holy places of God. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain. Bishops preached that it was punishment for sin, that God had turned his face away from England. But the truth was simpler. The age of peace had ended. For the Vikings, Lindisfarne was only the beginning. It was their first taste of Christian blood, and it intoxicated them. The monasteries were easy prey, rich, undefended, full of gold and women who would not fight. The Northmen began to speak of England as the land of churches, ripe for the taking. And so they came again. In the years that followed, the raids grew more savage. Iona, Jarrow, Wearmouth. One by one, the holy sites fell. Each time, the stories repeated. The slaughter of monks, the plundering of relics, and the violation of women who had sworn themselves to Christ. But some stories, whispered in the shadows of abbeys, told of things worse than death, of women taken across the sea to live among their captors. There are fragments in Norse sagas that hint at this. Tales of foreign wives brought from the west, pale-skinned and fearful, forced to bear children for men who worshipped Odin. Some of these women disappeared entirely. Others adapted, learning the tongue of their captors, becoming ghosts of their former selves. But some resisted in ways the Vikings never understood, with faith. One legend, recorded centuries later, spoke of a nun named Elflade of Coldingham. When the raiders came to her convent, she led the sisters in a desperate act of defiance. Rather than be taken, they disfigured themselves, cutting off their noses and upper lips, praying that the sight would repel their attackers. It did not. The Vikings, enraged by their defiance, slaughtered them all. Yet their story spread through the monasteries of Britain as a testament. Chastity, even in ruin, could defy the sword. But not all stories ended in martyrdom. Some were swallowed by the sea itself. The North Sea was not only a highway for raiders, it was a graveyard of secrets. Far to the east, in Denmark, there are burial mounds where archaeologists have found the remains of women who did not belong. Their bones tell of foreign diets, their ornaments of Christian origin. Their skulls show signs of violence, but also of survival. These were not merely victims, they were witnesses. They lived among their captors long enough to leave their mark. Faint traces of Latin crosses scratched into wooden charms, whispered prayers woven into pagan songs. The line between conqueror and captive blurred with each raid. Some Vikings began to see the Christian faith not as weakness, but as something strange and potent. They mocked it, yet feared its persistence. For all their brutality, they could not extinguish the light that glowed in the ruins of monasteries and in the eyes of women who refused to bow. The raids spread southward. The Thames carried longships inland. London burned. Canterbury trembled. But in the ashes, the nuns' stories endured, not as saints' tales, but as warnings. The Northmen had awakened something they could not understand, a faith that survived desecration, a defiance that outlasted fear. The sea was their god, and the axe was their scripture. Long after Lindisfarne's ashes were washed away, the Vikings returned, not as mere raiders this time, but as masters of terror. Their ships multiplied, their hunger grew, and with every village burned, their legends swelled into myth. The English called them the heathen army, but they were more than that. They were a moving storm of men who believed that fear itself was a weapon more precious than gold. Every raid followed a pattern. A monastery isolated on the coast, or a small priory by the river, places where bells rang instead of swords. The raiders would strike at dawn, when the mist still clung to the ground like shrouds, and the monks were half asleep from vigils. They would come silently first, their oars muffled with wool, their shields painted black to blend with the sea. Then, just before they landed, they would howl, a scream so primal it broke the spirit before the body. These cries became infamous across Christendom. Peasants whispered that the very sound of Viking horns could make a man's soul flee his body. And when they came, the first to fall were always the men of prayer. The Vikings believed priests and monks were weak, that their god had made them docile. But the women fascinated them. Christian nuns, in their eyes, were strange creatures. They lived without men, adorned themselves in black and white, and claimed marriage to an invisible god. To Viking warriors, who came from a world where women were wives, thralls, or shield maidens, this vow of virginity was incomprehensible, and that made it dangerous. They believed these women were witches of another kind, hiding power beneath humility. So to destroy that power, they had to desecrate it. The sagas, written long after the blood dried, never told the whole truth. They glorified the raids as feats of courage, omitting the shadows between the lines. But the church chronicles, penned by trembling survivors, filled the silence. There were stories of women dragged from the altar by their hair, of crosses shattered, of screams echoing through the cloisters. The Vikings would mock the crucified Christ, holding up the body of a nun beside a broken cross and laughing. Your God has no sword. The brutality was ritualized. Some historians believe it wasn't merely lust. It was psychological warfare. By violating consecrated women, the Vikings sent a message. Your God cannot protect even his own brides. It was a blasphemy turned into strategy, meant to spread despair faster than fire. But not every act was purely barbaric. There were darker complexities beneath the violence. An ancient pagan belief in taking power through possession. To the Norse mind, holiness could be consumed. By conquering a sacred body, they believed they absorbed its sanctity. This twisted fusion of desire and superstition made the raids upon nunneries even more terrifying. They didn't just want to destroy, they wanted to devour holiness itself. One account, recorded in the Annals Britanniani of Francia, speaks of a monastery near Rouen, where Viking ships came in 841. The raiders broke into the convent at dusk. Inside, they found 30 women, novices and nuns, kneeling before the Virgin statue. Their abbess, a woman named Leoba, begged the raiders to spare them, offering the church's treasure instead. They laughed and said they would take both. What followed was so vile that the chronicler only wrote, "They turned the house of God into a brothel of devils." When the Franks later found the survivors, only 2 were still alive. One had gouged out her own eyes. The other, a girl barely 17, was silent until her death. Her last words, according to the record, were, "The sea roared in their laughter." Such stories spread like infection. To the devout, it was proof of the apocalypse. To kings and lords, it was humiliation. And to the Vikings, it was power. They became more than raiders. They became nightmares made flesh. The English church began to fortify its monasteries, building walls, training a few lay brothers with spears. But walls meant little when the sea was open. By the mid-9th century, the Northmen had learned every river in England, the Ouse, the Humber, the Thames, turning waterways into warpaths. And wherever the rivers led, they brought ruin. In 851, London fell for the first time. The raiders plundered its churches, and again, the holy women were the first targets. Chronicles tell of St. Fridswide's Priory, where the sisters were trapped as fire consumed the cloisters. Some tried to flee into the Thames, still clutching their crucifixes. Others were dragged back by their veils. The Viking leader, a man known as Jarl Hastian, ordered that no one be killed until dawn. The screams lasted all night. To the Vikings, it was almost a performance. They wanted survivors. Terror, after all, traveled faster through rumor than through ships. And for every nun who died, there was another who lived to carry the horror to the next village. That, more than any weapon, made the Northmen immortal. But even among the raiders, there were divisions. Some, especially younger warriors, began to question the desecration. There are fragments in Norse poetry that hint at guilt. Verses where warriors speak of dreams filled with pale women, their eyes hollow, their hands reaching out from the sea. The skalds called them Halffinner, sea women, spirits of those who died in defilement. They said these ghosts haunted the ships, whispering hymns in Latin as the waves rose. Many longships vanished in storms after such raids, and in the sagas, these drownings were said to be the vengeance of the Christ women. Superstition began to creep into the hearts of even the fiercest raiders. Some refused to attack nunneries altogether, fearing a curse. Others began taking captured women back to Scandinavia, hoping to appease the spirits by treating them as wives instead of spoils. But mercy was rare. For most, captivity was a slower kind of death. In the Norse settlements of Ireland and Denmark, archaeologists have found Christian artifacts buried in pagan graves, crosses, rosaries, fragments of scripture. Many belonged to women buried beside Viking men. Some scholars believe these were the nuns and captives taken during raids, forced into new lives and new faiths. They bore children, raised them in the language of their captors, yet sometimes secretly carved the sign of the cross beneath the hearthstones of their homes. One haunting discovery, from a burial near Ribe in Denmark, revealed a woman buried with both a Thor's hammer pendant and a small bronze crucifix hidden beneath her ribs. To the Norse, that was unthinkable. Two gods in one grave. Yet it told a story of conflict, survival, and a kind of hybrid faith born from trauma. And yet, even far from their homelands, these women haunted their captors. The Norse ballads grew darker. The gods seemed quieter. When storms wrecked fleets or famine struck, the skalds whispered that it was because the nuns' blood had angered Christ. One saga, the tale of Kettle Flatnose, includes a passage where a Viking dreams of a woman in white walking upon the waves, her eyes bleeding, saying, "You took his brides, and now he takes your sons." Whether myth or memory, these stories marked a slow transformation in the Norse soul. The brutality that began as mockery began to sow doubt. Some Vikings started to see the Christian faith not as weakness, but as something with power, a power that endured desecration, that turned the violated into martyrs, the dead into saints. By the late 9th century, the tides of conquest shifted. The great heathen army swept across England, but within 2 generations, their descendants were building churches, marrying Christian women, and baptizing their children. The blood of the nuns they once defiled now ran in the veins of their grandchildren, and with it, perhaps, a strange inheritance of guilt. Still, the violence did not vanish overnight. Even as Christianity spread among the Norse, the old habits lingered. Raids continued into Francia, Ireland, and Scotland. And each time, the same pattern returned: the desecration of sanctuaries, the violation of the consecrated. The chronicles of St. Brigid's Abbey in Kildare tell of an attack in 886. The raiders slaughtered the priests but spared the nuns, taking them to the ships. None ever returned. Local legend claims their spirits still wander the boglands, their white habits glowing faintly in the mist, humming the hymns they once sang in Latin. It's easy, centuries later, to speak of Vikings as adventurers or explorers, to romanticize their sails and sagas. But beneath that myth lies something far more disturbing: an empire of fear built on desecration. Their ships did not just carry plunder. They carried the echoes of violated prayers. For the survivors, the few who escaped, life became a penance. Many were sent to other convents, unable to speak of what they had endured. The church called them defiled vessels, and often refused them readmission. The faith that had once protected them now shunned them. Some took vows of silence. Others disappeared into hermitages, carving crosses into the stones of cliffs facing the sea, perhaps waiting for the waves to bring vengeance or peace. One such woman, known only as Sister Thecla of Ely, left behind a single parchment. It was found centuries later, water-stained and half-destroyed, hidden inside a wall of the abbey. It read, "They came from the sea, but they brought hell with them. We prayed, but heaven was deaf. Yet I saw, in their eyes there was fear, not of us, but of what they had done." In those words lies the truth that history often buries. The Vikings were not unfeeling monsters. They were men, brutal, superstitious, and consumed by belief. Their cruelty was not random. It was ritual, and in their violence against the holy, they revealed their own terror of holiness. The nuns who suffered were not forgotten. Their blood sanctified the very ground where they fell. Over time, the church canonized some, remembered others in silence. The ruins of Lindisfarne became pilgrimage sites, not for gold, but for grief. Every wave that broke upon its shore carried whispers of that first massacre. And perhaps, in the crash of the surf, one can still hear faint cries of women who stood unarmed before gods of war and refused to yield. The Vikings believed that all men died twice. Once when their hearts stopped beating, and again when their name was spoken for the last time. But what they did not understand was that those they desecrated, the silent women they called Christ's brides, would never die at all. Their names may have been erased from the stones, and their bodies lost to the sea, yet the memory of what was done to them lived on, festering, reshaping faith itself. In the decades after the first raids, the terror they unleashed began to carve deep channels into the European psyche. What the sword could not achieve, fear did. Monasteries built higher walls. Churches fortified their towers like castles. Bells that once called to prayer became alarms of war. Every time a monk heard the crash of thunder over the sea, he thought of longships. Every time a nun saw a sail on the horizon, she thought of death, or worse. But as the terror spread, so too did the stories of resistance. Word of the women who defied the raiders, who cut their faces, bit their tongues, prayed as they burned, became sacred fuel for a faith that refused to die. The church began to reshape their suffering into sainthood. They were no longer victims, they were martyrs. The church could not stop the Northmen with swords, but it could make their atrocities into proof of holiness. Across the continent, convents began to tell tales of miraculous endurance. In Francia, the story of Saint Edburga spread, a nun who, during a Viking raid, stood before the invaders holding a crucifix, daring them to strike. They cut her down, yet witnesses swore that her body did not bleed. In Ireland, Saint Blathnade was said to have turned her own veil in a fire to ward off her captors. Whether myth or metaphor, these tales served a purpose: to reclaim what had been stolen, dignity, sanctity, and fear itself. But for every miracle whispered from the pulpit, there were thousands of silent tragedies buried beneath. And the Vikings, though they did not know it, were beginning to lose their war, not on the battlefield, but in the soul. For every church they burned, two more rose from the ashes. For every nun they shamed, the church wrote a prayer that would outlive their axes. Yet still, the raids continued. The Danelaw spread across northern England, a Viking kingdom within a Christian land. Towns once ruled by bishops now answered to jarls. Monks paid tribute to their former butchers. And among these invaders lived the memory of what they had done to the women of Christ. The Norse sagas from this period grow quieter about the old raids. The glory songs of pillage begin to fade, replaced by tales of uneasy dreams and strange visions. In the Landnámabók, a chronicle of Iceland's settlers, there is a curious entry about a warrior named Ronnie. It says he sailed west to raid monasteries and returned home with Christian women of white cloth. One night, as he drank by the fire, he heard a woman singing in a tongue he could not understand. When he asked his thralls, they said none of the captives had spoken for days. He died that night, choking on his own breath, and his ship was burned without a word. Superstition became repentance. The same men who mocked the crucifix began to fear it. Some Vikings started wearing small silver crosses alongside their Thor's hammers, not out of conversion, but out of fear of divine vengeance. They had seen too many storms sink their fleets, too many children die in their cradles, too many winters without sun. The bards whispered that the nuns' blood had cursed the sea itself. In Norway, a haunting folk legend emerged, the Song of the White Bride. It told of a Viking who captured a nun and forced her to marry him. She never spoke, never smiled, and every night she prayed in silence. One winter, she disappeared into the fjord, walking barefoot across the ice. In spring, when the ice melted, the man's ship sank in the same waters. From then on, sailors swore they could hear a woman's voice singing beneath the waves. Legends like these began to haunt the Norse imagination. The women they had once seen as spoils became spirits, powerful, vengeful, holy in a way their gods could not touch. And slowly, through fear and fascination, the North turned toward the cross. The conversion of the Vikings was not a single event, but a slow corrosion. It began in the hearts of men who could not sleep. The raiders who took holy women now found themselves drawn to holy places. They sought the priests they once hunted, asked for baptism in secret. Some claimed to have seen visions, not of Odin or Freya, but of pale women crowned with light, whispering forgiveness in foreign tongues. The church, for its part, knew how to turn guilt into gold. Missionaries went north carrying relics, stories, and the promise of absolution. The same lands that had sent longships full of killers now welcomed bishops with open arms. It was not the sword that converted the Vikings. It was the haunting weight of what they had done. Still, the past clung to them. In the early 10th century, when King Olaf Tryggvason brought Christianity to Norway, he faced open revolt. The old gods were jealous, and the old blood ran deep. Yet even the pagan chieftains who resisted baptism kept the crosses of gold and bone they had looted from abbeys. They no longer dared to melt them down. Too many had died after doing so. And then came the omen that silenced them all. In 997, near the coast of Jutland, fishermen claimed to have found something drifting on the tide, a coffin carved from oak, bound with iron, containing the body of a woman in a nun's habit, her hands clasped around a crucifix. Her skin, they said, was untouched by decay. They buried her where the waves had brought her, but storms lashed the coast for 7 days. When they dug her up again to move her inland, the storms ceased. The local people built a church on that spot. They called her the Sea Bride of Christ. No one could prove if the story was true, but it spread across Scandinavia like wildfire. To the newly baptized Norse, it was a miracle. To the old pagans, it was a warning. Either way, it marked the end of the age of desecration. By the 11th century, the Viking world was Christian in name, but its soul was still fractured. The blood of the nuns had not been forgotten. It had been absorbed into the new faith like ink in water. The sagas of this later period show strange contradictions. Warriors who prayed before battle, yet still swore by Odin. Kings who built churches atop old pagan burial sites. They had destroyed the brides of Christ, and now they sought to become his sons. But Christianity carried its own shadows. The same church that had mourned its violated daughters now turned their stories into weapons. Preachers in England and Francia used the horrors of the Viking raids as moral lessons, proof of divine punishment for sin. Women's bodies became symbols, their suffering stripped of humanity and reshaped into sermon and scripture. The real women, their names, their lives, their pain, vanished into legend. And yet, in rare corners of monastic chronicles, their humanity still breathes. A small manuscript in the monastery of St. Gallen, dated to the year 912, records a vision by a monk named Ethelbald. He wrote of seeing a procession of veiled women walking along the sea, their faces glowing with pale fire. They passed silently, carrying torches made of bone. When he asked who they were, a voice answered, "These are the ones who are unmade and remade." Their tears baptized the North. Whether vision or poetry, it captured something that history could not erase. The idea that from the horror, something sacred had been born. The Vikings' children grew up hearing these stories. They no longer saw themselves as raiders, but as heirs to both sin and sanctity. Many of the first Christian queens of the North were descendants of those same raiders. They funded churches, abbeys, and convents in silent atonement. Some even took the veil themselves, leaving behind crowns for the cross. The cycle had turned. The destroyers had begotten rebuilders. In England, King Alfred the Great, who had fought the Vikings for most of his life, spoke of them not only as enemies, but as instruments of divine will. "They tested our faith," he wrote, "and from their cruelty, we learned the strength of grace." It was a cruel paradox that the same terror that once defiled the church had, in its aftermath, purified it. But not everyone found redemption in the tale. Among the coastal villages of Northumbria, fishermen still refused to sail on the anniversary of the Lindisfarne massacre. They said the sea turned red at dawn, and voices whispered beneath the waves. They called it the Day of the Brides. No priest could convince them it was superstition. Too many had heard the voices themselves. Centuries passed, and the old stories blurred. The Vikings became legends, their brutality softened by time, their ships turned to poetry. Historians wrote of trade and exploration, of courage and honor. But in the dark corners of monastic archives, where mold eats the edges of parchment, the older truth still sleeps. The truth of fire, of screams, of vows broken by force and faith remade through suffering. And in that truth lies the reason their memory endures. For it is not the glory of conquest that survives the centuries. It is the echo of the innocent. By the time the last Viking ship set sail for the west, Europe had changed forever. The smoke of their raids had settled into the bones of every church that survived, every prayer that trembled through the ruins. The terror they brought had become history, but not the kind written cleanly in the pages of kings. It lived instead in the silences between words, in the faint shiver of bells that still rang along the coasts, in the hymns sung for those who had no graves. The Vikings had come for gold, for land, for glory. But in the end, what they took most was innocence. The desecration of the nuns was not just an act of cruelty. It was the deliberate unmaking of purity, a challenge to the very foundation of the Christian world. It had forced Christendom to look into its own darkness and ask whether its faith could survive desecration. And somehow it did. In the centuries that followed, the stories of what happened to those women became relics themselves, not of flesh, but of memory. The chronicles written in ink and fear were copied by trembling scribes, passed from abbey to abbey. The language grew colder with time, but the pain did not fade. Monks wrote of the holy virgins defiled by pagans, and each word carried the weight of unhealed wounds. Even the Norse who converted could not escape the shadow of what their forefathers had done. In Iceland, the early Christian poets, once skalds who sang of Odin, began writing psalms that sounded less like praise and more like apology. The Hymn of the Northern Sea, written around 1050, speaks of blood upon the bride's veil and waves that remember. It was a confession disguised as devotion, a plea for forgiveness that no priest could grant. The transformation was complete. The same culture that once mocked Christ's brides now wept for them. The desecration had been inverted into worship. Churches in Norway and Denmark were dedicated to unnamed holy sisters of the sea, their altars carved with images of veiled women rising from waves. Pilgrims came to these sites to pray for protection against storms, as if the very spirits of the slain nuns had become guardians of the waters that once carried their killers. It was a strange redemption, born of guilt and grief intertwined. The blood that stained the northern coasts had not vanished. It had been transfigured. Yet beneath this transformation lay something darker, the collective memory of terror that Europe could never quite bury. Every time the wind moaned across the cliffs of Lindisfarne, people said it carried the voices of the dead. The island remained a place of pilgrimage, but also of dread. Sailors refused to land there after dusk. The monks rebuilt their abbeys stone by stone, but even centuries later, visitors claimed to see shapes moving among the ruins, pale women walking toward the sea, their faces hidden, their hymns half drowned by the waves. The church turned those whispers into doctrine. The horrors of the Viking age became moral parables, proof that sin invited divine wrath, that faith demanded vigilance. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the fate of the unguarded, using the memory of the violated nuns as warnings to keep the flock pure and obedient. What had once been trauma was now weaponized as theology. But in the dark, private prayers of women, the story meant something different. For them, it was not about divine punishment. It was about survival. The nuns' suffering became a silent sisterhood that crossed centuries. Every woman who took vows of chastity or endured persecution carried, somewhere in her soul, the ghost of those who had died with their faith intact. They were martyrs not because they had chosen death, but because death had not taken their dignity. In the 11th and 12th centuries, when the tide of Christian expansion turned toward the north, missionaries found an unexpected welcome. The grandsons of the raiders now built churches over their ancestors' graves. They sent their daughters to convents in Francia and England, acts of penance wrapped in politics. Some even claimed descent from holy captives, as though to redeem their bloodline through the same faith their forebears once defiled. Archaeology has uncovered this uneasy reconciliation. In the soil of Denmark, at sites like Hedeby and Roskilde, Christian crosses have been found buried beside Thor's hammers, tokens of a faith caught between shame and salvation. And at the base of one Viking-age church, excavators discovered a foundation stone carved with Latin words that read simply, "For the brides who died." Those 5 words are all that remain of 1,000 untold lives. But Europe, ever hungry for redemption, turned memory into myth. The medieval storytellers softened the edges, retelling the raids as tests of faith rather than horrors of the flesh. The women became symbols, their agony abstracted into allegory. What had once been blood and fire became golden halos and stained glass. Yet behind every saint's serene face, the truth still pulsed, a truth too raw for liturgy. The Vikings, too, reshaped their own past. As Christianity took root in their kingdoms, they rewrote their sagas. The old tales of desecration disappeared, replaced by stories of heroism and exploration. The raiders became discoverers, the killers became kings. The longships that once carried terror now carried missionaries and merchants. The sea that had once been red with blood became a path to salvation. But no rewriting could erase what the waves remembered, and the waves did remember. Even into the late Middle Ages, sailors along the North Sea coast spoke of the white maidens, ghostly figures seen drifting on the tide, their faces veiled, their hands clasped in prayer. They said that when a storm was coming, the maidens would appear near the shore, warning fishermen to turn back. Those who ignored the omen never returned. In the churches of Northumbria, votive candles were lit each year for the lost brides of Christ, though no one could name them anymore. Historians would later dismiss such tales as superstition. The sea's cruelty turned into legend. But the persistence of those stories reveals something deeper. They were not merely ghost tales. They were memory made manifest, the conscience of a continent refusing to forget what it had allowed to happen. For centuries, the Church had prayed for the souls of the invaders, for their conversion, their peace, their salvation. Yet rarely did it pray for the women who had paid the price. Their names were erased, their graves unmarked, their stories used and silenced. But the land remembered, the wind remembered, and the sea, most of all, remembered. The Norse word draugr once meant a spirit of the restless dead, a soul that could not move on. In some Icelandic tales, draugr are not the ghosts of warriors, but of women wronged, returning to haunt the living. There is one poem, preserved in fragments, that speaks of a woman rising from the tide, her veil torn, her eyes hollow. He who broke the vow shall drown in the vow. The poem ends with the sea swallowing his ship. Scholars have long debated whether it was myth or metaphor, but the truth is simpler. It was guilt given form. As the centuries passed, Europe built cathedrals upon the bones of that guilt. The Viking Age ended, but its shadow never truly lifted. The great conversions of Scandinavia, the Christianization of the North, were not victories of theology alone. They were acts of expiation. A civilization born in conquest sought forgiveness from the very faith it had tried to destroy. And the ghosts of the nuns, nameless, faceless, broken and sanctified, became silent witnesses to that uneasy peace. Even now, if you walk the ruins of Lindisfarne at dawn, when the fog drifts low and the sea breathes against the stones, you might feel it, the weight of centuries pressing down, the echo of prayers that never ended. The wind carries faint voices in Latin. The sea hisses against the rocks like whispered penance. Beneath your feet lies a graveyard of faith and fear intertwined. History likes to close its wounds with words like conversion and civilization. But what the Vikings did to Christian nuns was not healed by baptism, nor erased by time. It lingered, like salt in the wounds of Europe, a reminder that faith, no matter how divine, is born through human suffering. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of those dark centuries, that sanctity and savagery are never as far apart as we like to believe. The Vikings thought they were breaking God. Instead, they only forged him in fire.